Peterson interview, take one, marker.
Punahou, it's a private school. It's on a beautiful campus that looks like a college campus. It is actually a kindergarten through 12th grade school. My only experience there was in the high school. So we had our own sort of quad, our own area that was the high school area, but really resembles a college campus. And much of what we did there was college prep, and so we had schedules that were like college schedules. Our whole experience was meant to mimic, and actually to mimic and prepare us for the college experience. It was a strenuous school. My classmates excelled academically, artistically, and athletically. I was not at the top of my class, but I held my own there. It was also a warm campus, and I say that because I've seen some private school campuses since then, and that whole idea of the stress of a private school or of a academically challenging school, I didn't feel that stress. I mean, I felt the challenge, but not the stress of it. So there was this sort of a welcoming community on the campus for me. You know, I don't remember exactly what the motto was, but there was a sense of you've been given much, and so much is required of you. The school was founded as a school for missionaries' children, and so that whole missionary idea of serving the world, not conquering the world, but serving the world, was still there when I was there, even though it's not a terribly religious school. But that whole sense of mission, you've been given much, and so you can serve the world with that. My first memory of meeting Barry Obama, and you know, it's been some years now, so my best memory is that our mutual friend Rick Smith introduced us. And Rick was fairly new to the school like I was. He was a year behind me, so he was a junior when I was a senior, and Barry was a freshman at that time. And if memory serves, I was having a conversation with Rick, and he said, well, you need to meet this guy, Barry. And because there were only 4 black students out of 1,600 students in the high school that year. I hadn't met Barry yet because he was a freshman. He had just come into the high school. So that's how we met. And the 3 of us bonded pretty quickly, and I say that we certainly weren't an exclusive group. I spent more of my time with other folks than I did with Barry and Rick, but we did have a standing meeting about once a week for the 3 of us to get together and talk about life. So we called our standing meeting Ethnic Corner, and it was tongue-in-cheek. We talked about rapping together, and this was when rapping was not hip-hop. It was just having a conversation. We talked about school. We talked about girls. We talked about world issues. We talked about whether the non-black girls at our school, which was all the girls at our school, would ever date us. We talked about social issues because that was important to us. And so one of those questions was, will we ever see a black president in our lifetime? And after talking through it, our consensus was there will be a black president, but it won't be in our lifetime. And of course, none of us was thinking, and it's going to be one of us. We did, but especially related to just the social situation. Now, I've read Barack Obama's books, and I've read about some of the agony, racial agony that he felt. That year, if he was feeling it, it wasn't evident. We talked about real issues that were race-related issues on our campus, but it wasn't an issue of discrimination or truly feeling out of place, because we had our circles of friends. And so the agony that I read about later in his high school experience was not something I was aware of at that time. And it wasn't anything I was experiencing for myself either. One of the issues with Rick and Barry and me is we were used to being in situations where we were the only black person there, or we were bridging two cultures. I mean, that was just a part of how each of us had grown up. So, this was just a chance for us to kind of bond, but not really with discrimination on our mind. This is a highly racially diverse school. So the question of whether black students were treated differently, it's hard to answer. There were only 4 of us, and we weren't making a big deal about our blackness. That year, I was the only black student who was not biracial. And we hung out in groups that were not race-based groups, except for this time that we had. So when Barry and I played basketball, pickup basketball before school in the mornings, we were the only black guys out there. There were Japanese guys, Filipino guys, white guys. So they were just our friends. In terms of faculty and staff, aside from the fact that our numbers were so small that they didn't know if they might say something offensive to us, but I don't think we were treated differently other than we're different. Does that make any sense? My hangout was the attendance office, and the attendance secretary was there. The athletic director's secretary was there. They shared an office. I was the only black person who hung out in that area, but all students from campus are coming in. If you show up late, you have to go to the attendance office. So we're connecting with all kinds of students. There are people who made racial jokes. And you're in high school, so you have to decide, is that a joke, or is that something that's going to offend me, or is it somewhere in between, or do I want to make waves? But it was not a hostile environment. At least from my experience, it was not a hostile environment for black folks. If you think about who Barack was as a high school student, he was my friend. And as a freshman, when we had these conversations with Rick in our ethnic corner, he held his own with a junior and a senior, but I wasn't thinking in terms of, boy, this guy's really impressive. He's just a friend, and we're just having these conversations. Seeing him on the national scene, I was highly impressed with the grown man, Barack Obama. And the first time I saw him actually on the national scene was at the Democratic Convention in 2004 when he gave the keynote speech. And so on the one hand, he echoed those conversations that we had in high school. He talked about many of the things that we talked about in high school. But on the other hand, of course, he's a grown man now, so he's not a goofy high school kid, high school freshman. He's a grown man, and so I was really impressed with how self-possessed he was, how confident he was, and how clearly he expressed vision for us, even when he was just running for the U.S. Senate. So yes, I became impressed with him as a grown man. In the 2004 Democratic Convention keynote, a couple of lines stood out for me, and I think I even stood on my feet when he started saying, this is not a liberal America or a conservative America, it's the United States of America. It's not blue states and red states, it's the United States. We're not Democrats and Republicans, we're the United States of America. So there's that whole sort of litany that I thought, the audacity to do that at the Democratic Convention. But then there was another line that comes across kind of as a throwaway, and he was talking about how parents need to turn off TVs and encourage education for students, and he said, for their children, and he said we need to eradicate the slander that says a black kid with a book is acting white. And that echoed right back to the kinds of conversations that Barry and Rick and I used to have, because that was an issue we had all grown up with as academically minded black guys. In their cases, they're both biracial, but everyone looks at them and sees black guys. And so as academically minded black guys, we had heard for years, you're acting white. I don't know if folks still hear that today, but for him to say that on a national stage in 2004, I just felt like that's my friend again. And he's expressing those values that I still hold and that he still holds. So this is where my age gets to be a problem. I don't remember if I ever met Barry's grandparents. I don't remember if I ever went to their apartment. I think I might have, but I can't say for sure that I did. I knew he lived with his white grandparents. He talked about that. I knew his mother was sometimes there and sometimes not. I didn't really probe into those questions, but I knew who he lived with. I knew generally where he lived, because he was a lot closer to campus than I was. And I think I might have been there once and met his grandparents once, but I don't remember for sure. To talk about Barry as a basketball player, from my experience, I have to start by saying I'm not a very good basketball player. And I'm playing with him. Again, I'm a senior, he's a freshman. He was a better basketball player than I was in pickup ball, but this was pickup ball. This was not, he later played on the team, on the school team. My understanding is he was like seventh man. He probably could have been higher on the roster if he'd played according to the coach's plan. If you talk about an overtly black game, my white grandson plays basketball and he plays an overtly black game. He plays in a league that is predominantly black, that's run by black folks, and he learns to play that way. We play teams that play a different style, and this is probably the style that the Punahou coach wanted, and it's a lot of passing, it's a lot of outside shooting, it's a lot of waiting, and I think Barry wanted to. He did have the outside shot. He definitely had the outside shot, but he wanted to run and gun, and coach was not having that. Now, I have to say I didn't experience that. I wasn't there when he was playing on the team, but I can imagine that. Now, when we're playing street ball, when we're playing pickup ball, it's all whatever you want to do. So, yeah, there wasn't a lot of passing. What I like to say is race is not real, but race does matter. And it's not real because biologically it doesn't add up to anything significant. There's more variation within what we call races than there is between what we call races. There's no real scientific evidence for any appreciable way that we use the word race the way we use the word race. And we can talk about a person's ethnicity, we can talk about the origins of their genealogical origins. Those things can matter. There are some biological issues that matter, but they don't follow the same lines as we use when we talk about race. Race is a social construct. When I think about Barry/Barack Obama, I think about how he had to, and this is part of this began maybe before high school, but at least in high school, he had to determine what it means to be a black man in the United States, because although he's only half black, and in fact, the half of him that is black didn't come through that slave experience that many of us did. But what he had to deal with was the fact that anyone who looks at him, anyone who interacts with him, anyone who connects with him sees a black man or a black boy and then a black man. And so he has had to determine what does it mean to be a black man. And I think there was some trial and error with him. I think playing basketball, playing a black style of basketball was something he chose to do because he decided I'm a black guy, and so I need to do this. There were parties that I've read about that he went to. I used to go to those parties. I wasn't there when he was there, but I had gone to those parties before. They were, most of them on our military bases. They were black parties, a lot of dancing. I mean, it was mainly dancing. He went there, I think, to get a sense of, okay, is this part of my blackness? Hawaii is a different place than the mainland. I mean, and there's all these different places in the mainland where, had he lived in the South, he might have done this a different way. Had he lived in the Northwest, he might have done this a different way. But in Hawaii, because there were so few black folks there, and most of them were connected to the military and he wasn't, I think that's just the way he chose to go about it. He knows that people see him and see a black boy, a black man. But in Hawaii, those ethnic issues are always out there. We don't hide our ethnicity in the ways that some other folks do. He just had to claim some things for himself. And I think even later, when he graduated from Columbia University and then moved to Chicago into the inner city, I think there was some more testing of what does it mean to be a black man. And he claimed some things for himself. But I think also in the process, he claimed the totality of his racial makeup. It wasn't just I'm a black man. I'm claiming that, but I also was raised by my white grandchildren. I have white grandchildren. He has white grandparents. I was raised by them and by my mom. And so I think he spent some time defining who he was. And I think when I talk about the confidence that I saw in 2004 at that Democratic Convention speech, I think that was a man who had claimed who he was for himself. Rick and Barry and I got together on the Cook steps just outside the attendance office and have our ethnic corner. It was fun and serious at the same time. So I'm hanging out in the attendance office, and sometimes Barry would come by at lunchtime and say, do you want to go to the snack bar? And I never had money. I brought my lunch. But they did have a great roast beef salad sandwich that I loved. And so he would beg me to walk with him to the snack bar to get this, whatever he wanted. And I never had money. So the end of that conversation was always, all right, I'll pay for you. And so it cost him a lot for me to walk with him to the snack bar. You know, you never know when when people sign your high school yearbook, who's going to be signing it. So you give it to everybody. And I'm the sort of person who, I'm a souvenir person. So I have all my yearbooks from middle school through high school. And I did know that at Punahou, I was going to school with some people who were going to make a difference in the world. I didn't know that I was going to go to school with someone who was going to be president. And certainly didn't think Barry Obama would be that person, not because of any level of competence, but because he was going to be a basketball player. And I was going to be a lawyer. So this is what he wrote. Tony, man, I'm sure glad I got to know you before you left. All those ethnic corners, trips to the snack bar, and playing ball made the year a lot more enjoyable, even though the snack bar trips cost me a fortune. Anyway, been great knowing you, and I hope we keep in touch. Good luck in everything you do, and get that law degree. Someday when I'm an all-pro basketballer and I want to sue for more money, I'll call on you, Barry. I didn't have any contact with Barry post high school that I can remember. I mean, I probably saw him when I went back to visit campus, but I was in Boulder, Colorado once and found a book that I discovered he had written, which I had no idea he had written a book, Dreams for My Father, by Barack Obama, who I knew as Barry. And I read that book, and there were several issues that kind of stood out for me. First of all, when he talks about his high school experience, I recognized the pieces of it. I recognized the places he talked about. What I didn't resonate with or didn't know about were what was going on with him internally. So that was a revelation for me. And I know the names of some of the folks who were in the book were changed. I know those people. I know some of those people in their real experience, and all of that rang true to me. I was really impressed by his experience post-college and going and doing community organizing with churches in Southside Chicago, and actually what that did for him as a person of faith. You know, he became a Christian out of that experience, and that meant something to me. The religious part was only a surprise because I knew him to be an agnostic. When the three of us, when Rick and Barry and I talked, we talked about religion some. I was a Christian. Rick and Barry were confessed agnostics. But when I read how this experience happened for Barack in Southside Chicago, where he's doing this community organizing, and these women, these older women in these churches said, "You need to come to our church." And then him hearing messages that resonated with him, and that's how he made this commitment to be a Christian. It sounded like this is how Barry would do it. If it ever happened for him, this is how it would happen for him. I did follow the scandal with Jeremiah Wright. So I was following the whole campaign. And that was a big bump in the campaign. I had some strong feelings about that whole experience, and they began with, I had known the name Jeremiah Wright. I didn't know Barack Obama's connection with it. I knew Jeremiah Wright as a great preacher, as a model of preaching, and not only that, as a great community organizer from a church perspective. The kind of work that his church did in the community was a model for other churches. I knew that there was, that on the surface, if you look at what their church was about, there's some places for criticism, but to my mind, they weren't really legitimate criticism. It was a misunderstanding of some things. When YouTube video of Jeremiah Wright's preaching came out, I watched these clips, and it was clear that these were clips stitched together out of context. My wife and I spent a weekend researching those clips and finding the entire sermons, and we were floored by the actual messages of each of those sermons, which were just the opposite of the message that the clips were creating. When Jeremiah Wright talks about, when he said, we talk about God bless America, and then he looks at the biblical record and says, God would not bless what we're doing as Americans. And he has a litany of what God would not bless. That was his message. But his dedication to the Bible, his dedication to America was all very clear. He wanted the United States of America to be more than we are. And he wanted us to live up to what we say that we are. Now, he's a black preacher of a particular style, and he's a provocateur, and that was his style. Folks who were sitting there, black, white, Hispanic, who would sit in Trinity United Church of Christ, know that style of preaching, know how to receive it, know what to do with it. But if you're coming in from the outside and that's not something you're familiar with, then you're going to misunderstand what's going on there. So there was that whole element. I also think Dr. Wright did not do himself any favors because he was just retiring at that time, and I think the notoriety, the infamy, got to him, and so there was a little period right before Senator Obama gave that a more perfect union speech in Philadelphia. I understand why he felt like he had to make that speech, because there was a period of a week where, in my opinion, Jeremiah Wright did step out of he wasn't in the pulpit anymore, and he's talking to people who aren't going to understand what he's saying, and he said some things that I wish he hadn't said. I can only give a guess as to why there is perhaps a pattern of Barack Obama cutting off some people from the past. My best guess about that is that it's politics, in the sense that you have to keep moving on. I didn't follow him in Illinois, but I went back and kind of learned some about how he was in the Illinois State Senate, and he learned the rough and tumble of doing politics. That's why someone as young and perhaps somewhat inexperienced as he was could ascend to the presidency, because he had a laboratory in Chicago, Illinois politics, where he learned some things. He lost his first Senate bid to Bobby Rush, and he learned some things there. And I think there was some cutting off that happened then. So I believe Barack Obama's message of hope and change and I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. I believe he believes that. I believe it as well. I think his vision for America is my vision for America. But one reason that Barack Obama got to be Barack Obama, President of the United States, is because that's not all there is to him. He knows how to work those systems. And I think probably the cutting off of people is an unfortunate part of that system. When I saw Barack Obama at the 2004 convention and heard him speak, my political ears opened up, and I started paying attention to what he was doing, because he was running for Senate at that time, and then in 2006 he gave another speech about religion and politics, and from then on I started thinking, I hope he runs. And that was summer of 2006, and he announced in February of 2007. And he, I'm trying to remember this time frame. I think, yeah, he was already a senator, and was campaigning for Harold Ford Jr. in Tennessee. They came to Nashville, and Senator Obama spoke. And then there was a rope line, and I went up there, made sure I had my business card with me, and I looked him in the eyes and gave him my business card, and he put it in his pocket, and I was hoping that might be, an in for me, but I haven't heard anything since then. I campaigned in 2008, and for him for president. I went knocking on doors. I took my grandson, 4-year-old grandson, with me, knocking on some doors, and I also campaigned online. And by that I mean I started a blog primarily to talk about Barack Obama. And for me, the issue was this. I was an evangelical Christian, and I was very impressed with his vision for America, and with my perception of his ability to carry out this vision. But there were some issues as an evangelical that I had to wrestle with. Remember, this is 2008, and where many of us were culturally on some major culture war issues like abortion and like gay rights. And the gay rights issue wasn't as big a deal for me, but the abortion issue was. And so I mentioned that to say, I wanted to say to my fellow evangelicals, this guy is worth looking at. And there may be some issues here that you don't agree with him. And so I want to wrestle with those issues with you. And my view on pro-life and pro-choice issues changed in that process of me wrestling with these things. And I would say today I'm pro-life and I'm pro-choice. That's what I would say today. I think it's a false dichotomy that we put there. But trying to reconcile voting for him with the views that I used to have helped me to think through some things. So I was so intellectually and in the blogosphere, I was campaigning, as well as going door to door and making phone calls and that sort of thing. And my wife and I became political junkies because of that whole experience. all of it mattered to us. But it was all because of this vision. It was all because of this is what I think America, this is the America I've always wanted. And so let's go for that. Election night, we were sitting in our living room, and I was there with my white wife, and I think all four of my white children, and at that time my four white grandsons, who were like 4 years old through high school. So this is a scenario, and we're watching the TV, and incidentally, all of those people campaigned. All of those people campaigned for Barack Obama, and none of them were politically minded people at all. So we're watching state by state, and it was just elation. It was just a feeling of elation, that whole celebration. But so I'm teaching this adult Sunday school class. It's our church's only adult Sunday school class. I'm the only African American in the church. I'm teaching a bunch of white adults. I asked in this classroom, regardless of how you voted, how do you feel about the outcome? And I knew how my wife felt. I knew that there was one other person in the room who was very supportive of Barack Obama. I was not prepared for the anger and vitriol that came from other people in that classroom. But there was one person, actually, I'm not going to identify her, but there was one person who said, I did not vote for him, but I was watching on TV and I was seeing that Grant Park scenario, and I was watching the African American people there, and she said, I was so struck by how moved they were, by how significant this was for them. And she said, so I didn't vote for him, but there's something there that matters to me, that this was so significant for them. And I'm hoping he's going to do do something good for America. But so, I felt that, but I felt it in a room full of my family, my white family. Whenever you ask a question about whether something is race-related, it can easily be dismissed and it can easily be embraced. And what I mean by that is this: when you think about the vitriol that we experienced that Sunday, no one in that room would say that it was race-related. No one would admit that it's race-related. But I believe that, one of the reasons that I did sort of the campaign I did online is because I knew that if Barack Obama was going to be elected president, he would be doing violence to the image of the United States president that we have had for 200 and some years. And I knew that was a huge hurdle for people to hop over. I think in that classroom, there were a number of things going on. One is these people believed every negative story they heard about Barack Obama. Why did they believe it? I think partly because, well, he's the Democrat, he's the liberal, and we don't agree with that stuff. But also, he's exotic, he's different, he's not what a president's supposed to look like. They would never say that last part, but I believe that was part of what was going on there. When we talk about, and I talk about race issues a good bit, the issue is not that race is always the only thing going on, but it is important to recognize when it is going on, when it is there, when it is present, and it's not always the only factor. I think some people are going to vote for their party regardless. I think when it came to Barack Obama, there was another element other than party that came across, and I think the level of emotion was because of that, because they chose to believe that he wanted to leave aborted babies who were born alive, botched abortions, that he would choose to leave them to die. All these things. He was a Muslim and an atheist at the same time. They believed all of those stories, despite the fact, and I didn't tell you this, the Sunday after the 2004 convention, I actually preached a sermon at my church. I actually introduced my church members, the church members at my church. I'm not a pastor, but I was preaching that Sunday. I introduced them to Barack Obama in 2004, and it had nothing to do with his stance on any issues. It had to do just with that speech and the idea that that he thought he was going to be a basketball player, and now he's running for U.S. Senate, and never got to be that basketball player. And so I used that as a sermon illustration. So the people in my little predominantly white church knew the name Barack Obama 4 years before he started running for president, or 3 years before he started running for president. They knew his name because of me, and yet here we are now, Sunday after election night, and they have believed all this other stuff they heard, even though they heard about him first from me, and they heard he was my friend. And so I had a little anger that they were believing strangers instead of believing me, who they know. So that's why I think, yeah, perhaps there was race involved in that as well. Barack Obama was elected to be president of the United States. He was also the first black president of the United States. There are a lot of, and during that campaign, there were a lot of reasons that campaign was successful. And one of them was that he set out this vision. Another one is he is a great speaker. Another is that he's extremely intelligent. Another is that he's worked that political role that he got out of Chicago. And I think there was this, I think the charisma of Barack Obama created a place where people could kind of project whatever they wanted to project on him. Even though, and this is one of the things I said I tried to do as I was campaigning for him, I knew there was a whole lot of substance under that charisma. But the charisma largely is what got him elected. But it's also what set other people who didn't like him off, because he's a superstar. He wasn't just a guy running for president, he was a superstar. And so there are folks who are, on the far left, who projected him as a far leftist. They wanted him to be that. There are folks on the right who wanted him to be a leftist because they wanted they painted that picture of him so they could have a reason to reject him. I always saw him as a moderate. I listened to what he was saying. I read his books, listened to his speeches. I hear how he's drawing ideas from past Republicans, how he's worked with different groups. I heard about when he was president of the Law Review, how he bridged different groups. That's something we had in common. So I saw this person who can bridge these, the sort of be a bridge over the culture wars, if I can mix those metaphors. But people saw him as whatever they wanted to see him as, and that's whether they supported him or didn't support him. And then as the first black president, then there's that whole issue of how black is he going to be. So some folks think in his 8 years that he wasn't black enough. He didn't do enough for the black community. You even hear that today. You know, Barack Obama was not elected to be president of the black people. He was elected to be president of the United States, of all people. But there are people who felt like he was not black enough, and there were people who felt like he was too black. Even today, there are people who say he didn't do enough for the black community in all of his 8 years. And there are others who say he talked too much about race, about black things. So there's the funerals that he spoke at for, like, Trayvon Martin, where he said, if I had a son, he might look like Trayvon Martin. And then he spoke at the funeral for the 9 in Charleston. And for a lot of people, he was being too black. He sang Amazing Grace at that service. He sang it the way black folks sing Amazing Grace. I think he walked that line. There was a book, and I don't know if you can use this, but there was a book by Shelby Steele written during the campaign, and I think it's called A Bound Man, and why we love Barack Obama and why he can't win. And what Steele was not necessarily saying he can't win the election. What he was saying is no matter what happens, Barack Obama is going to be criticized from both sides. He can't win. If he talks too much about race, then folks are going to criticize him. If he doesn't talk enough, people are going to criticize him. The thing about Barack Obama is, one, he's very bright, and two, he's been doing this balancing act all of his life, or at least all of his sort of high school and adult life. And there are folks who've lived their own lives, who have their own experiences, who think they would have done things differently. So there are some black intellectuals who felt like he didn't do enough for the black community, didn't speak enough about race, didn't speak enough about the oppressiveness, the oppression in our culture, or various issues. And Barack Obama knows all of those things. He knows all those issues, and he's not necessarily smarter than them. He's just put himself in a political position where, in a place that fits him. Those folks probably could not be elected president of the United States because some of them are prophets. I mean, in the way that they operate in the country, they operate out of a prophetic stance. Jeremiah Wright would be an example of that. He operates out of a prophetic stance. We need those folks, but they're not going to be president of the United States. Certainly not the first black president of the United States. Barack Obama had the temperament, the intellect, the balance in his own experience, and so he could do but some of those other folks probably couldn't do. I think the campaign and election of Barack Obama brought latent racism out. And in the 8 years that he served, we saw some more overt forms of racism come up. I didn't think there was enough of that overt racism to warrant to keep him. Well, it didn't keep him from getting reelected. I was surprised at how I believe that was one of the factors in how we got the current president in office. I think the rhetoric that the current president spouted was so much in juxtaposition to the rhetoric of Barack Obama. People latched onto that. That honestly surprised me. The raising of latent racism under Barack Obama's time didn't surprise me, but I was surprised by how that that racism gave us the current president. And I would even say, you know, you asked a question about race earlier. I would even say that not just the overt racism, but the more subversive racism, maybe even unconscious racism, got this guy elected. And I say that because of statistics that I've read about particular views on immigration, for instance. White evangelical Christians are the only ethnic religious group that believes that the browning of America is a bad thing. When you look at other ethnic racial groups, that is not the case. And white evangelical Christians voted for the current president at a tune of 81%. And their support for him hasn't waned much. I am frustrated as I'm angry with folks that I used to worship with to have turned in this direction. And honestly, I think it's a betrayal of the Christian message. I mean, that's my perspective. And I can't say for any particular person why they voted how they voted, but it grieves me. It grieves me that 81% of white evangelicals voted in that way. And it matters to me that amongst non-white evangelicals, they voted the opposite. So that tells me something when we talk about, because our first thought about that is, well, those black folks and those brown folks voted according to their race. Well, if we voted according to our race, if we were shaped by our race and our racial experience, what makes us think white folks aren't also shaped by their race and their racial experience? First thing I would say to Barry is good job. And I'm sorry you didn't make it to the NBA. You know, I'm one of those people, like a lot of people, who want to sit down and have a drink with him. But I want to do it to reminisce, and then to say, you know, I would want to joke with him and say, how in the world did this happen? But mainly what I'd want to say to him is, thank you for bringing our vision to America, and for displaying it so well for us. I have some friends who do character education in high schools, and they sometimes have me come out and bring my yearbook, and they tell the story of Barry and Rick and me getting together for our ethnic corner. And most of these kids, these high school kids that we're talking about, are African American students, and they let the kids read this inscription, not knowing who it came from, and so the question that gets asked is, do you think this guy who wrote this became an NBA player? And they'll say no, because everybody wants to be an NBA player, and only a handful of people get there. And then the next question is asked is, what do you think happened to this guy? And the answer usually is he's either in jail or he's dead. And then my friend will say to them, well, he's not in jail and he's not dead and he's not an NBA player. As you know, there's only a handful of people who get to be an NBA player. But he has a job that only one person does. And then there's the big reveal of what he is. And of course, then everyone wants to touch it. You know, they want to touch that yearbook. You know, I taught a class once at a church. I was a guest teacher. And this is a wealthy, old, and when I say old, 200-year-old congregation. And the class I was teaching was mostly older people, older white people, older, wealthy white people. They invited me to come for 4 weeks to talk about race. And in fact, it was right after the Charleston massacre. So we talked some about that. And one of the things I invited them to do was an exercise that I borrowed from Michael Emerson, who teaches sociology. And Emerson has his students go home one day or 1 week and try an experiment. And what he has them do is whenever you tell a story about someone in your life, and it's a white person in your life, say white person. So my white wife, my white child, my white friend. And then you need to write a paper, a 2-page paper about what that experience was like. And so he gives this assignment to all of his students regardless of their ethnicity. He says, now I know this is going to be uncomfortable for some of you, so if you choose not to do it, then you have to write a paper about why you chose not to do it. And so they come back, and inevitably the process is the same. He asks people who did it and who didn't do it. And the only people who chose not to do it, who choose not to do it, are white folks. The people of color always choose to do it. Some of the white folks do too. And what he finds out is that the people of color are used to talking this way about anyone. Some of my friends laugh at me because I almost always identify someone by their race that is not real, but that does matter. Sometimes it's just to paint the picture, and sometimes it's because it's relevant. But many of us, including, I know I'm talking kind of in circles, including these people in this Sunday school class, these older white folks, have been taught all of their lives not to talk about race, so there was a woman who invited me to the class, and she's trying to tell us a story from her experience, and she's identifying this woman, and she cannot bring herself to say she was a black woman, she was an African American, because she'd been taught all of her life not to identify those things. I think it's important as we go forward, becoming even more and more ethnically diverse. I think it's important to pay attention to issues of race and ethnicity. Jennifer Harvey wrote a book called Raising White Kids, and she is a white woman, and she's also, I think, a sociology professor, and her issue is she tries to encourage parents of white children to name race early and often, so that her children don't grow up being surprised by racial issues. So we think about those big incidents like Charleston or Charlottesville or Ferguson, or the election of the last two presidents. and racial issues come out, and we've taught our kids to be colorblind, but all of a sudden now everyone's talking about something racial, and we don't know how to talk about it. Our kids don't, but also adults don't know how to talk about these things, and we need to. It needs to be a part of our everyday life, not to make life more difficult, but to make life more real, to make it more authentic, to hear from. I heard this expression the other day, cultural humility, which was a new idea to me. It's the idea that when I interact with you, I'm coming from my perspective, but your perspective matters to me, and my perspective is not the prevailing one. People of color often know that. Some white folks don't know that. Their assumption is we're the default, we're the normal, we're the normal. My 7-year-old granddaughter saw that Jennifer Harvey book a couple weeks ago. I was preparing for a talk, and she saw that book, and she said to me, she said, "Peepaw, some people have funny names for books." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Like this book right here. It's called Raising White Kids. I think that's a funny name." And she's a blonde, white granddaughter. And I said to her, I said, do you know why that book was written? And she said, "No, I don't." And I said, well, there are some white people who see their own lives as normal and everyone else's life as different. And I said, now you're not one of those people because you have a white grandfather, you have a black grandfather. She also has a white grandfather. You have a black grandfather. You go to school with people who are mostly brown, and there aren't many other white people like you. So you can see yourself as normal and as different. And you can see your friends can see themselves as normal and as different. And I said, but there are some white folks who only see themselves as normal and see everyone else as different. And I said, and that's why we need a book like this.